to go without microphones?
I can bring the camera up nice and close so we can get the recording a bit better.
You're recording through these.
That's okay, as long as everyone feels that they can hear all right. Yeah, I think maybe.
Do you hear better with the microphone? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, let's stick with microphones.
It's called a roger, and it comes by Bluetooth into my hearing aids.
Of course, that's no problem. We can use the microphone. Are you okay to
Yes,
check
of
with that?
course.
I'm fine.
Well, kia ora koutou, and thank you everyone for coming back, and Ruby for the introduction, and Philip for sitting down and talking with me. It's been a joy through this exhibition to talk to Philip a lot about the works that his father Toss did. And I'm going to call him Toss today rather than Woollaston, because you're Woollaston too, and it gets all a bit confusing, all the Woollaston. So I'll talk about Toss rather than Philip, and I'm sorry, about than Woollaston, and occasionally I might call you Toss, because
That's right, I mean, I call my grandchildren by my children's name, and the other way around, so it's a generational thing.
yes.
My mother, like most mothers probably, when she got agitated, my mother used to have to run through the whole gamut of names. Her husband, our father, my siblings, her siblings, and so on. Luckily I was the youngest, so I could usually get out of range before she got through it.
So I thought I might start this conversation with something that Philip wrote in the introduction to this book. And one of the things about both Toss and Philip is that they're fantastic writers, and they really bring a lot of Toss's work to life. But I'm just going to read the first paragraph here. This is Philip writing. I have no recollection of ever being drawn by my father, despite the clear evidence that I was. That is not surprising. A natural unself-consciousness was at the heart of what he was trying to capture. In this, at least, his practice was a very antithesis of traditional portrait practice. I wanted to ask you about that you had no awareness of your father drawing you, and that was kind of the point of what he was trying to do. He wanted to capture those idle moments. And there's a lovely anecdote in the book of you getting offside with your dad at one point. I wonder if you might expand on that.
Yes, well, I can't guarantee that I never had any awareness of being drawn. But what I said was no recollection. It's a different thing when you get to 80. But he did try to draw us without our knowledge, and the reason was he wanted to get that unconscious relaxation in which people can be themselves. And I think you quote him in the same book as saying that when he had sitters, he would sometimes spend half a day with them before he even put pencil to paper, because he needed them to forget why they were there at all, and become themselves again, instead of becoming some sort of ideal of what a sitter should be. So it's a bit ironic, really, that we are in the portrait gallery, named portrait gallery, when it could be argued that most of the works here aren't portraits, in the sense that they weren't people sitting there in their traditional sort of 19th century way of posing for a portrait, because they weren't posing at all, they were themselves. And just the example that Jane mentioned was one, I must have been about 9 or 10, I suppose, young and foolish, and my sister Anna, who's along there lying on the floor reading, and it may have been a drawing for that actual painting, I'm not sure, because he always worked from drawings, he never painted from life, he painted from drawings. Was lying on the floor in front of the fire reading a book, and Dad was painting her, drawing her, and I just found this so hilarious, because she didn't know what was going on, so I was giggling and shortening and saying to her, she doesn't know, and of course she knew that the whole thing was destroyed in a flash, and my recollection is that my father was rather cross.
I wondered whether you might expand a little bit on what you said last night, that some of the people may not have heard if they weren't here, about the way in which Toss looked at things
Yeah.
before he drew.
Yes, I don't know if any of you can recall seeing, probably back in the 1980s, a kaleidoscope documentary which had him at one point, it was quite a long one, interviews and shots of him drawing in the field. And there was quite a long sequence of him sitting on the beach in Ruby Bay, which is near Mapua, where he once lived. And he was looking at the view, and the photographer was fantastic because he actually focused it on his eyes, and you could see him looking at the view quite slowly, quite for some time, and then down at the blank sheet of paper he had in front of him, and looking up again. And this became sort of rather more rapid in my recollection as it went on. And much later, looking at this documentary again, I realised that he must have been forming, first of all, an image in his mind of what he wanted to get from the landscape. Not the landscape itself, but what he wanted to highlight in it, what he wanted to point to in it. And then it's as though he was projecting that onto the blank sheet of paper. So then eventually he grabbed his pencil, I can't remember if it was a drawing or a watercolour, grabbed his materials, and in about a minute it was all done. And he used to say, once I recall him saying to me, look long, draw quick. And the idea being that what he wanted to get was in here, and the actual act of drawing was just really as rapid as possible a means of getting it out of his head and onto the paper, because he'd already done the work in his head.
Yeah. Well, you made that comment to me about the portrait of Chan up here as well. That portrait is of Philip's wife Chan, just shortly after they were married, and that was the result of 1 hour of looking and 1 minute of painting. And I was saying to Philip that I have a 17-year-old who I think needs to take that approach. He's doing art, and he loves drawing from photographs, and I actually think he needs to spend more time looking, because I think he would get so much more out of what he's attempting to draw, because it's not just about, one of the things I adore about Toss's work is it's not about replication, it's about, his idea of what he's seeing, and also of the forms and capturing a sense of the person beyond just the outward appearances, which I think he does remarkably.
Yes, somebody, and I can't remember whether you quoted this or somebody else quoted it, asked him about his distortion of features. Why does he distort features? And he said, well, sometimes a feature is funny. It needs to be highlighted. And if you look along there's a portrait of this second from the wall, the second one coming in, Austin Davis, who was the director of the Suter Gallery, and he sat for a portrait, more or less in a more or less traditional way, I suppose, because I think he's sitting in a chair. But he didn't like the painting at all because his nose was too big. Obviously, his nose was to my father a defining feature, perhaps. But it wasn't just making caricatures of people. It was also trying to find what makes them tick, trying to find the thing which is sort of defining of their persona rather than their sort of anatomical peculiarities.
One of the things that you said to me that I thought was really interesting is, so we've got two of his commissioned portraits here that, the Buckins isn't officially a commission in terms of how the family thought of it, but the Paris portrait is. And one of the things that Philip said to me is that Toss didn't insist that people bought his portraits when they commissioned them, because he knew that sometimes his works could be quite hard to take, and you may not quite like how you were seen in them. And so there are some portraits that were commissioned that didn't end up presiding for commissioners. And I thought the comment that Les Paris made about the portrait of himself was really interesting and very big of him, you know, to say that it was a wallop to the solar plexus. He sort of saw that he caught something of himself in it, which I thought was, you know, I think it sees something of both Toss and of Les.
Yes, yes. He actually made it an explicit condition, and he didn't have a lot of portrait commissions, but sort of, they were quite significant ones. And he made it an explicit condition that he would paint what he wanted to paint. There was no room for any sort of direction as to what the portrait should be like, and there was no obligation on the commissioners to buy it at all. He needed that independence, and they needed that assurance, I guess, and that worked quite well. As he said in a letter to someone, I can't remember who, he said, "I'm becoming a society painter at last, but it's a very small society."
I wondered whether we might touch slightly on Toss's process more generally. We sort of talked about his process of looking, but the paintings that he actually worked from drawings rather than working directly to paintings for the most part, at least early in his career. Do you have a recollection of sort of seeing the transformation from the drawings to the...
No, the paintings that were sort of painted from life, and the only one here that I think would be the little Bill's portrait over there, which is 1934. It just grew a year younger in the work in Jane's research. I had it as 1933, but it turns out it's 1934. And that was 10 years before I was born. And I think that was probably about the last one. I'm not sure, Leslie Lucia might have been painted live too. This is his employer's daughter, niece, I think, over here. And I don't recall the date on that, but it's about the same period.
42. 42, yeah.
Okay, well, it's most likely done from drawings then. But I would say certainly by the late 40s, he'd completely given up any idea of painting from life. And I really suspect it would have been the early 40s.
Yeah. So there's an example of what we're talking about. So behind you there is the two portraits of Elvira Wycherley with the cello. So there's a tiny little drawing that's framed, which was actually made at the concert of her playing. And Philip tells a fantastic story that the family law was he made it in the concert hall, and he was shaking so much that he was making the chairs sort of shake and being shushed by those people around him. And then you can see the work right next door, of the painting itself, which gives you a sort of sense of that process and the way that he would work from them. But sometimes he'd also paint things quite a long time after the fact. So there's a portrait down the end here of Edith pregnant, which is dated 1946, when she wasn't in fact pregnant. 44 was her last child with Philip.
Yeah, I'm vintage 44, and there's nothing after that.
But the work is definitely dated on the back, 1946. So it shows how he would return to his drawings sometimes after the fact. And in fact, there's a very interesting one here, where he's sort of created a whole hybrid self-portrait. So it's based on his 1942 drawing, which is in the case, and then he's returned to it, and sort of perhaps aged himself, I'm not sure. But he certainly returned to the work in 30 years after the fact.
Yes, my understanding, which may not be particularly well informed, was that was done from the drawing, which I think was on his wall for a long time, and so he was consciously doing a self-portrait of himself as a 32-year-old when he was 66. So it's and I mean, it certainly doesn't look like a 66-year-old man there. So I think that's right.
I wondered whether I might ask you about Edith, your mother. She seems so central to so many of his portraits, and we sort of talk about her as a muse, but I think in a very everyday sense she was his muse. She's not sort of muse has kind of a highfalutin kind of quality to it, but she was so important both to his art but also to his ability to paint. And I wondered whether you might talk a little bit about
Yes, she certainly was his most ardent supporter, I think, in the early days, and then joined by a few patrons like Charles Brash, University of Ethel, and Rodney Kennedy, of course, was also an early supporter, but it was just a few people. But she was there every day, and she was doing the household things. She was raising children. They were living in what was known locally as a mud hut, which was my father had built when he was young and single, and didn't envisage marrying and having a family out of mud bricks. He made the mud bricks on Desi Wells' property, sun-dried them, built this little one-room shack. It was really a bachelor's little shack with a studio. It did get a little bit enlarged before I came along, but for 14 years my mother was running that with no running water, no electricity. The hot water system was a copper outside the back door. It was a wash house area. It was pretty hard going, and I don't remember much of it. I was 4 years old when we left there. Probably my most significant memory was as a 3 or 4 year old racing my mother to the door. We'd been somewhere, and turning back to tell her I was winning the race, and crashing through a glass pane door, old-fashioned glass pane door, no safety glass. I still have the scars on this arm. And of course, here's my mother with no telephone, no car. The nearest neighbours were the Welleses who lived a couple of paddocks away, and a profusely bleeding child. And this was really the reality of life for her, that things were hard work and high risk, I guess you'd say. The tragedy of it is that she was herself a talented painter, but there was no room in her life, I guess, physically for it, and probably there's only room for one serious artistic ego in a family. So something had to give, someone had to give, and so she really sacrificed that. I remember much later she used to do beautiful little. She loved cats. She used to do little pencil portraits of her cats, which turn up on sort of, you're reading a book and something falls out. So, but no, she gave up her own artistic practice, which was rather more traditional than Toss's, to support him.
Did the portraits of her that Toss did bring you, do they remind you of her, or how do you?
Not really. Some occasionally they do. There are some obvious differences. Most of the portraits we're looking at are of her as a relatively young woman. My recollection of her is always having been grey.
She went grey colour. She went grey colour.
Yeah, and I think what I just said, you can see why. So these early ones, dark-haired, I don't recognise. There's a photograph much reproduced, which is in Jill Trevelyan's book, of her as a young woman, and she doesn't remind me of herself at all. She reminds me very strongly of my sister as a young woman, Anna, which is interesting. But then you come to the later portraits, like the one here in a straw hat down here, which certainly is very recognisable, and the trademark plait she had by the single plait usually over her shoulder. The earlier ones, no, I love them as paintings. I I got a little emotional when I was speaking last night because it is actually like being back in a family environment on a large scale. Because many of these paintings I know of old, many I lived with at various parts of my life until they were sold and went somewhere else. Two of them I still have myself, but it's more the continuation of the 60 years that they span. It really is rather wonderful. Some like Charles Brash, Poet by the Sea down there, that was on our walls for quite a while before he got it. Some of the ones in the 1950s I remember seeing painted. We've had the Anna story. Those two, the boy and the girl down there, are me and my sister, aged about 10 and 12. And so I guess there's a bit of a connection with that one. But yeah, no, it really is quite moving to me to see so many of them. And when you came, when you sent me the final selection to look at, I said, only 65. I mean, there's so many works out there. You've left all sorts of them out. And then when I saw it here, I thought, yeah, 65 is actually quite a good exhibition.
Yes. I think we would have had trouble fitting any more in, that's for sure. We would have been hanging them on the road. I thought I might go back in time to one particular work, which is relates to the works behind the era of Eroa in the publication era. There's a copy of this that you can look at on display as well. Philip was actually integrally involved in making Eroa happen, I think, and I wonder whether you might, or the publication, I wonder whether you might talk a little about that.
Yes, perhaps that sounds a little grand, but the dad hired the model, whose real name wasn't Eroa, but he gave him a Maori name because his real name was Rodney, but he wanted to actually try and explore what are the differences between Polynesian faces and Pākehā faces, just as he did later on between Chinese faces, because my wife was Chinese, between Chinese faces and Pākehā faces. These things really interested him. What made people look the way they look? What lies underneath the skin? What's the internal thing that does that? And so he was always looking for somebody who he could draw or paint, and he worked with neighbourhood children, the neighbours' children, pretty hard. But then he got the schoolboy who came once a week after school for an hour or so, and was paid to sit. So he had this great collection of works, nearly all monochrome. I only know one watercolour, and he wanted to do an oil, but he never quite found the right thing to do. He never quite got ready. He did drawing after drawing, ink wash after ink wash. So I'm not sure who came up with the idea of publishing a selection of them, but I certainly was at home as a 19-year-old, I guess, 20-year-old, and helped him with editing it because the captions needed to be quite terse and small, and talked over his selection with him when I was really more of a sounding board for that, and took a few of the material sort of decisions that had to be made because it wasn't being published in the usual way. It wasn't a very commercial proposition, I guess. And then I went off from my OE to the UK and took about 100 of them with me, and I think I flocked a fair few through the New Zealand House bookshop in London, but I probably had to give away a few anyway.
If you're interested in his practice, I'd highly recommend reading the it gives you a real insight into the relationship he builds with Rodney, and just his approach to painting, but also the frustrations that Rodney felt as a sitter. He kept on wanting. One of the things I love about Toss and all of his writing is he's very good at sending himself up and sort of not taking criticism personally. And Rodney was constantly saying, "We need to do a real painting." Rodney really wanted a real oil painting of himself. He didn't think that the sketches were quite enough. And so you see him, there's this sort of tension between them, but also over time you get the sense of him becoming accustomed to sitting for him and being more comfortable.
Yes, it took a wee while for him to persuade Rodney that he could just be himself and not have to sit bolt upright in a chair and be painting. Again, I guess that's the 19th century idea of portraiture that hung on here for quite a long time. But yes, it was quite a rewarding relationship, and they got to know Rodney quite well. I think my mother was very fond of him too, it was just one of those strange things. It was unusual, I think, for any artist to have the same sitter for 2 years and just keep on doing the same person. What interests me about it is the variety of you don't get the sense coming through the booklet that these are all the same. They're all sort of terrible, one or two, and so on. And so there is a lot of variety in there, in his mood, in his appearance, in the way Toss was feeling about it. It was I think quite a formative experience for Toss as well.
I think this is probably my last question, and then maybe we can open it up to the floor. So one of the comments that a lot of people have said when I've been doing an exhibition of Toss's portraits, and you're very aware of when you read about Toss, as most people know him as a landscape painter, and I think this exhibition, finally makes it very clear that he was just as much a portrait painter as a landscape painter. And I know that Toss also didn't like labels like that, you said. And I wonder whether you might just sort of talk about the place that portraiture held in his practice.
Yes, he quite explicitly drew no distinction between portraits and landscapes. He said that, if I can paraphrase what I recall him saying on one occasion, was that the people are objects made of volumes, planes and lines, as are landscapes. And so he said, once you actually get the object in front of you, then you start to put these volumes, these shapes, these planes and lines down on paper. Then the problems are the same in finding out what are the bones of a landscape and what are the bones of a person sitting in front of you. So he quite explicitly drew no distinction between the two. And I think he once said he drew what was available to him, and if that was his co-workers at Sligo in the apple packing shed, which it often was, or if it was the Wells family having a musical evening, or if it was the mountains across Tasman Bay from Mahua, they were all grist to the mill.
I think he also got very frustrated though to be pigeonholed as just a landscape painter.
Oh yes. He felt that sort of somehow devalued the portraits which he had done. Yes.
Well, should we ask, does
Yes.
anyone have any questions?
Oh, I love this. So you have to hold it right to your mouth.
Yes, the title of the painting is English.
Of Michael Caine?
Oh.
It's just around the corner on the side.
apart from sort of art school work, which looks very much like art school work, she went into botanical work briefly, and then she was also for paid employment. She was an illustrator at the medical school, doing anatomical work. But I don't know of any in public galleries.
I wonder whether there's a lovely essay that George Bellion wrote in Between the Lines about the partners of famous New Zealand artists, and she wrote one on Edith in that book, which was published sometime in 2000, and I wonder whether there could be an illustration of her art in that. I'm not sure of that though.
I'm not sure either. Apart from her little cat drawings, she didn't do very much after she married Toss, she hadn't really developed her practice at all, but she certainly had some talent that could have been developed.
Any questions?
Go there.
Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic to hear all that. I just wondered, were you given any encouragement by your parents, either of your parents, by the artists, to follow in their footsteps?
Well, we certainly weren't inhibited from doing so. I really hadn't either the talent or the inclination to go very far. I do remember my one and only oil painting was 12 years old, I think, at home from school with a cold, and so I purloined some of Toss's materials and tried a little landscape, and I decided it was a very, very poor copy of what he did, and there wasn't much point in that. I did go with him when I was in my early teens a few times to sort of evenings where people were usually at the Grahams. David Graham was himself a painter, unfortunately died very young, and he and his wife had this rapidly growing family, but not far from us. And I do remember trying to draw people, but I found it very, very difficult.
Okay.
And I didn't really have the inclination, or I didn't have the determination to succeed. On the other hand, my sister Anna was a serious and talented painter. She painted under her married name, Anna Castleberg, so as not to be confused with Toss. There certainly the Hocken probably has the best collection of hers, but she's has the centre got an injury? Yes. Yes.
Of course, Toss wanted the face to be power.
Sorry, can you?
Oh, sorry. Toss face wanted to be power. It's really poetry that you've got of this.
Yes, there is. I'm not sure how much of it was ever published. He, as a young man, he had the odd piece published in the Nelson Evening Mail, which would take amateur offerings. And certainly among his papers at Harper, there are some poems there. He was really more derivative as a poet than a painter. It's interesting because he really admired the English Romantics, and he wanted to be another Shelley or another Keats, and so his poetry was much less adventurous than his painting. So I think he made the right call as a young man.
I was just going to say that he was a very good writer.
Yeah.
So the letters are of course fantastic and have been published, but things like Sage Tea, but he also wrote quite a lot about his travels in Europe in the 50s or was that 60s? Yeah, and they were published in the newspaper, and you can get those 3 papers passed. And and they give you a really good, he just has a wonderful way of telling a story and sharing about his practice.
Yeah, his prose is superb, and because he has something to say, and he's blunt, forthright, and his letters, I think, I still enjoy reading them.
It's Martin's sort of question. I think what you've pulled together in this exhibition is absolutely remarkable. And I'm trying to think of the artistic equivalent of a landmark, and I can't think of the correct word, but it really is an outstanding exhibition. How difficult was it to pull the works together, get the commissions? Because I know Papa's pretty famous for being difficult. How did you do it? Congratulations.
Well, the credit goes to Becky at the back of the room for that, in terms of the permissions and things. I think the hardest job for me was choosing, because there is just so much, as Philip alluded to. And I think particularly with the drawings, I really wanted the drawings to have an important part of the exhibition, and there are so many drawings. The Woollaston estate still owns many drawings, and I was sort of overwhelmed when I asked Philip if I could look at them, and sort of folders came out. But the drawings to me are really important for understanding his practice, and particularly with things like the commissions. I find the commissions probably the most challenging works for me to get my head around. And when I saw the drawings that the estate gifted to Papa, it was a bit of an aha moment for me, because you could see how he was approaching each figure and sort of trying to capture them and then putting them together. And likewise with the Buchan family, I struggled with that until I discovered the fact that it was a family on a wet day stuck inside, and as a mother I simply identified with what he was trying to capture, that sort of sense of chaos and perhaps disharmony. But it was a hard job making the selection, I think, and it's huge credit to the Portrait Gallery for bringing it all off. So that's down to Becky sitting in the back row there. So big thanks to her.
Which one in the back row?
In the black and white shirt.
Well, it's just a wonderful expression, and it's been so enlightening to have the conversation between you. You've partly answered my question, which the difficulty of selection, because you had such a wide choice. Watercolour portraits. You focused on oil and ink, and I just wondered, did you decide not to represent watercolour? Well, not many watercolour portraits. Yeah.
There were originally a few more watercolour portraits. There's a lovely portrait of Eroa that was in the Arts House Trust. I think one of the few watercolours. I think actually there's only one watercolour, which is the portrait of Anna. I think the watercolour portraits come later, and there's a lovely huge one in the Suitors collection of John Foster, which I also really wanted, but I just couldn't have everything, and so I think they were sacrifices, and I think the inks probably have also dominated partly because of Eroa, but the watercolour portraits are lovely, and I think the one of Anna here in particular just shows his wonderful experimentation with media. So it's not at all to devalue them. It was just also they tend to they don't tend to be the watercolour portraits so much earlier on. They tend to be later, and there were so many strong oils in that area that it was sort of hard not to do the oils instead.
Hi Philip. I just wanted to ask, you spoke about Toss looking long and drawing quick. Was it the same from the drawing to the painting? Did he look at the drawing and paint quick after that?
That's a very interesting question. I was thinking about the difference between his drawing and painting techniques. Last night when we were looking at the show, I think basically yes, because he would look, if he up, but he couldn't avoid them. Generally rusty old drawing pins onto the wall because artists don't know how to look after paintings, do they? There were some differences in that he could go work in bursts on the painting. So the oil paintings were slow to produce, sometimes over several years, but often the long looking was there. And then there would be sometimes quite frenzied sort of brief periods of applying paint, and then looking at the part finished painting, and looking back at the drawings and so on. So yeah, I think the basics are the same, but there are obvious differences, and you keep coming back to all of that.
Philip, the key thing about your father's paintings, Hugh Temple, so is the palette, isn't it? If you look at all these, it comes out of a particular view of colour. Do you think? I mean, my brother, we've owned minor paintings in the family, and it's so distinctive. Do you note that yourself in thinking about these?
Yes, I've always enjoyed his palette, and
yes.
it has changed over the years somewhat, but it's always been based on well, not always, because prior to 1935 probably, he didn't have, he had met Flora Scales, who introduced him to the Hans Hofmann school, and through that the Ostwald theory of colour, which was based on a glow with white at the top, black at the bottom, and all the primary colours around the equator, and you can actually get almost any hue of any colour from that. And the idea, I think, was that you need balance there. So he started off with his very early works, like the Bernard Wells portrait over there, which are quite stark in their colour. A little bit in the Elvira Wycherley too, with the strong orange. And he went for oranges and greens in those early days, very much so. Later on, he became sort of more, a little more tempered, I think, a little more complex in his colouring.
Yes.
But always still earth tones, and even in his portraits, you can see the earth tones coming through. Yeah, it is quite a distinctive palette. But I think the Hans Hofmann school and the Ostwald theory of colour was a sort of turning moment when he was in his 30s, 20s, in his 1920s.
But the watercolours are much clearer in colour, is that right?
Yes, by and large, yes. Sometimes he overpaints, but often he's just doing a single wash here. Just the nature of the material, of the medium, I think.
There's a wonderful thing, I think he wrote in the Faraway Hills, which is, I want to paint the land, sorry, I want to paint the sun, but after it's been absorbed into the land.
Yes.
And for me, I think that captures a lot of his colour as far as landscapes go. And I guess if those are the colours you have to hand, you use them for your portraits too.
Yes.
Representational, isn't it, of the area that he lived in, and where he saw the lights and everything else around him. I mean, all the skin colours of sandy bays, sandy colours, and criterion all around him. It's just representational of where he's come from.
Yeah, well, he actually originated in Taranaki, but yes, as a 19-year-old, he first came to Nelson to pick apples, and somebody pointed out their poet. But he, that quote was a particular reference to the light of Nelson, which is quite distinctive, and yes, those earth tones and that painting of the light was very much Nelson.
Well, unless there are any other questions, I might wrap it up there. Thank you, Philip, for sharing so much of your family and your history and your knowledge. It's a real privilege to hear just to get your insights and to learn more about this wonderful artist. So,
Well, thank you, Jane. Thank you for assembling this wonderful exhibition. It's like a retrospective of my life for me.
No.